people didn't really get a look in until quite late on. And so it's almost, and you know, I would also probably say social scientists as well. So you know, you can sort of, there's this sort of mathematical view where you know there's risk and all that, but there is a sort of deterministic type approach to this modelling. But it's kind of, and of course you need that right at the beginning, but I suppose it's getting the more sort of system-wide aspects into that model generally, you know, broadly defined, I think is quite important. So just initial thoughts.
Can I just interrupt you a second, Duncan, just to say I've just switched on the recording.
Oh, yes,
I know the rest of us are happy with that. Are you happy with that?
Yes,
it's only
yeah,
for
absolutely.
internal use.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not going to be on the web, is that right?
No.
Okay,
It's just that if we need to sort of, rather than trying to take lots of notes, it's easier to feel we've got it there if we need it.
Thanks.
And it's particularly for the people who we'd have liked to have had here this morning, but wanting to
catch
up.
I should just clarify, it will be on a YouTube channel, but that's a private YouTube channel which you can only see with the link, so it's not like searchable.
Thanks. Yeah, right.
Sorry, do carry on, but I just wanted to chip in.
Yeah, exactly.
Lisa, what about you?
Hello. Yeah, so just for Duncan, I'm a PhD student in the Disease Dynamics Unit at Cambridge. Previously worked as infectious disease epidemiologist at London School, and I come from a mathematics background. My PhD is now sort of more looking towards the interface with policymakers and decision makers, specifically how we can improve the use of modelling during outbreaks. So this is very, very relevant. But it's early days in terms of my PhD, but I sort of contribute as much as.
What did you think of the sort of framework I sort of set out in my outline, Lisa? Is it a reasonable sort of skeleton to fit things into? And
yeah, it was really helpful to draw everything together. So I was very grateful that you've done that. I didn't have to. Yeah, I really liked it. I'm wondering if we wanted different headings.
Have you got this document, Duncan? Sorry again.
Yeah, I've just got it now. So
okay, great.
So I haven't looked at it before. Apologies.
No, that's fine. But I
you've got access to the IDP Dropbox.
Yes, I'm just logging into that now, actually.
So what we're trying to do is to keep critical current stuff for each challenge theme in its folder there, and try and prune it. So for instance, if we move on from one version to the next, there's a sort of overarching archive folder in the Dropbox, and I tend to move old versions to that. So if you think, you know, we get to the third version of this document and you think some vital chunk's gone missing that you would like to resurrect, it'll probably be in the archive folder. Hopefully we'll have a name which will make it reasonably recognizable. Yeah, that's
perfect.
I suppose so you wanted to change the headings, Lisa?
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about it. So you've got the first one as like preparedness, which I think is great, and then the second one and third one.
Emergency interventions.
And interventions, yeah. I don't know if we wanted to take a different route, maybe. I feel like maybe the best thing to do is to add all the ideas we want and then think about the headings.
Dennis,
I think
I've just sent a request with a different email address. Could you possibly accept that, and then I can have a look?
Oh right, so you for the Dropbox.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that in a minute. Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking was that if this provides a set of coat pegs to hang things on, that the next thing might be to contribute all the sort of best references we've got. I mean, I think on each of, hopefully for each of the sort of phrases or sentences I put there, there will be, we'll find an editorial in the Lancet or someone's recent paper or indeed older papers that will bear on that.
What did you think was missing, Lisa? Because were there particular areas that you thought weren't here at the moment?
Yeah, there's things that I think we could add. So I think we should add. Just checking if you. Yeah, I think we should add more about communication between modelers and policymakers. And
so that sort of goes across this, doesn't it, in the sense that Dennis has done it by epidemic stage, whereas issues like communication are sort of general across the whole time frame, I guess. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah. And then maybe we have touched on cooperation, sort of international support, etc. So I think that's good. We can add a lot in there.
Lisa, can I just come back to your point about communication? So you thinking this as like the two-way communication between them. So I guess, there's like how the scientists communicate the evidence to the policymakers, but there's also that interaction in that, at least my understanding for this epidemic, is often the policymakers are asking very specific questions of the scientists. And that's questionable whether they should or how they should be doing that, because there's a question then is you don't go to the scientists and just sort of say, oh, what should we do? You go to the scientists and say, well, what happens if we put lockdown in this week or next week? And what does that mean for our healthcare system? That's a different question as to, should we actually be trying to eliminate, like as Dennis has said before, should we be trying to eliminate the disease or should we? So I guess it's just that question of how, what questions, because that's kind of policy loaded, right? If you're saying, should we do this or that? Because you're saying these are the only two things we're thinking of for policy. And as a scientist, you might say, well, neither of those are very good. You should do this other thing. So kind of that interaction and how that works. Is that what you're thinking of in communication?
Yeah, I would definitely be keen to approach both sides.
I mean, so which you could say is a sort of problem of micromanaging that really, a suggestion perhaps is that to get the best scientific advice, government should try and keep back from micromanaging.
I think
to set, in other words, to set and ask advice on the big overarching things like, can we, would it make sense to try and eliminate the disease while and if not now, might it once we've got vaccination or something, or broad questions like that.
I think what was missing really is what is the objective function you're trying to minimize or maximize, and how's that, because if scientists can't really do anything unless they're trying to get trying to answer a question. And I think that's it. In a way, that was sort of left to the scientists to interpret, rather than say we're trying to minimize deaths or we're trying to minimize morbidity, and therefore without that clear advice, and that's, as far as I'm aware, has never been set. It's always, if you like, a moving target that is reacting to the latest problems that the politicians have, rather than saying at the beginning, this is what we're trying to do. And then you can get scientific advice to help you achieve those aims. And I think that was missing.
Yes. Yes, and I think the behavioural and public acceptance sort of aspects suffer from the short-term thinking. Perhaps it's not always easy to disentangle what's helpful and what's a problem. And
also, I think another sort of, I don't know if it's communication, but if you look at the SAGE minutes, you've got people like Dido Harding, defined as a scientific expert there as well. which, you know, we may or may not agree with. So, and you know, who's on these committees, and you know, who's observing these committees? People from number 10 who perhaps aren't defined as scientists, or we wouldn't define them as scientists, are there, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I suppose it would be, I suppose if one's going to comment on this kind of thing in depth, we really need to look at a few examples of other countries as to what their sort of structure of advice and sort of timescale of interference, if I call it that. You know, are the politicians asking new questions every week, which is the impression one gets in the UK, and which is almost certainly too frequent. Yeah.
Can kind of weave communication into the headings you've gone through. So we can split it up into problems at different stages of the epidemic.
I suppose the other thing is we've been talking about how governments, perhaps there are examples, possibly New Zealand, possibly Taiwan, places like that, which have just had actually had a much better, more effective setup. But there's also, I think there's a sort of generic underlying problem, which is possibly, you know, where something sort of like a game theory approach or something is needed, which is if you look at the very beginning stage of a pandemic, where you might say that you could really say that, for instance, in the present pandemic, that by late January, actually, people who thought things through could see that, I mean, were saying this could very well be a major global pandemic. And you know, you could well say, if that was taken seriously, why didn't we have a complete international lockdown on travel, with people simply not allowed to fly from one country to another unless there was reasonable testing in place, lockdowns in countries where the disease had actually got to, and things like that. You know, the kind of things that were done in March could have been done in January. Well, and if you ask why they weren't, I think it's because it's partly because politics is playing a game, and what they would be being asked to do there was to adopt a strategy of where you spend a lot of money, you have a big cost, because you know the things I've just described would be big costs, and if it then turns out that that does indeed squash the disease, possibly you won't get the credit for it. People will just say, well, you spent several billion pounds and completely buggered up international travel for 2 months or whatever it would be, you know, and only 300 people in the world died, because the pandemic was stopped, and it's very difficult against that to say, well, actually, if we hadn't done those things, it would have been, you know, fast forward to a view of what's going on now with 500,000 dead or whatever it is, you know, and in other words, you're if you sort of see it as a game, you can see why there is a tendency of governments to react too late, bluntly.
And you can also think
it's not just they reacted too late on this occasion. There are, like, sort of, you know, politics is a game. So I mean, game theory, I think, is an apt description. So, you know, there are game theoretic reasons why people don't play the right cards soon enough.
And you've got to think about who the players of that game is or are. So
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things is, you know, the World Health Organization declaring public health emergency of international concern. That took a bit of time, and therefore it's quite difficult for a country like the UK to say, actually, we're going to close all our ports, you know, outside the international health regulations, for example, because you need, and that's a very bold thing to do.
So then it becomes a question. So perhaps the question is that, you know, the World Health Organization ought to be the answer to the problem I've just raised, because it ought to stand, it's like a referee standing a little bit outside the game, and it says, well, actually, this is a real alarm. You've got to play the cards. You've got to put those billions up front. You've got to accept disruption for a couple of months. We as the World Health Organization are probably going to be doing this to you every 5 or 10 years for the foreseeable future as new pandemics come along. So the question then becomes, why did the World Health Organization not respond more forcefully? And, they did a number of things, like advising that air travel should continue, which in retrospect, you think, why the hell did they do that? I mean, yeah.
Well, I just was gonna come in with one point in that. So I've always wondered whether the challenge in the UK is one of our last sort of epidemics that we've had to deal with was H1N1. So the swine flu.
Yeah.
And I think that they did go in quite hard and heavy. They bought all these vaccines and they got really slammed then for it. So Public Health England had like a whole investigation into why they'd wasted billions of pounds. But when it first started, there was no way of knowing that actually there was actually the older population did have this immunity. It wasn't going to spread the way they thought it would. And I guess that's, you're kind of at the beginning, you're sort of gambling, right? You there's so much uncertainty, you don't know which way it's going to go. And so it's that trying to make that call is very tricky. And so either you kind of you invest loads up front, but then actually it's maybe not as bad as you thought it was going to be, and so you've potentially, people could argue, you've wasted that, or you try and wait for a little bit to see, can we find out a bit more before we have to make these huge investments. And so I mean, there are ways people do look at this, because this idea of like delaying the time at which you should start your control, people have looked at using sort of real options. So I guess it's the idea that you've got these there's a lot of uncertainty, but you've also got these decisions which to a certain extent are slightly irreversible. Like if you spend millions of pounds on a vaccine, you can't get that money back. But equally, if you don't act, then you have all these deaths, which again are irreversible. And so it's how you balance those two amid the great uncertainty that's going on. So I think it's just that tension is quite tricky to manage.
Right. I mean, and the thing is that probably, without knowing about in detail, probably criticizing for stockpiling the swine flu vaccine is completely the wrong response.
Well, yeah.
The government should have said, congratulations, that's £1 billion quotes wasted. But frankly, it was the right thing to do, because it was it's like a roll of the dice. And if the die had come up a different way, it would have cost far, far more than that. And, this would have been the right thing to have done. So,
it wasn't the wrong thing to have done anyway.
Yeah. So.
Because I think people have said there's like a real distinct between the sort of the European ones who have that memory of swine flu, and the Asian countries who have the memory of things like SARS and MERS. And they were much more, let's try and eliminate, let's have really good contact tracing, because they have that memory. Whereas I guess in the UK there's that risk that you kind of think, oh, it's just going to be like 2010, and they're just scaring us. It's not really that bad.
I think that's a really interesting point, because you sort of think about different countries' response, and they're sort of either Asian or not. And so if you look at, say, Australia, right, it decided to go Asian, right, in terms of its response. And as you say, I mean, we in the UK haven't really had this too much. So as you say, the sort of institutional or policy memory isn't really there. I was thinking about, this document in terms of structuring it. Is it maybe, is it a good way to think about sort of emergency response phases, or is that how, I don't know, how it's done? Lisa and Shara, how would you?
What do you mean exactly?
So I don't know, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery.
Okay.
Four stages, or is that how's it done in your world?
Well, I think it sort of corresponds to that. I mean, I've used different words, but but I think it's the same sort of time sequence of decisions, isn't it? I mean, I think that.
I suppose
I think I was thinking the same as you, Duncan, that it's the sort of time order of decisions. And
I think it's the
I
loop.
suppose, I mean, and coming to the kind of experience and everything we've done. I mean, part of me said when the thing came along and we had lockdown, and on the basis that it was a disease that killed 1%, I have to say that one of my main thoughts that floated at the top of my head was this might be about the right level of pandemic to get people to take the damn thing seriously. I mean, Bernard Silverman, as you maybe know, is having discussions about writing this paper about, of course, you know, is COVID a wicked problem? You know, in that it was sort of somewhere just on the edge if you really had to take it seriously or whatever. And as I say, what floated at the top of my thinking was that we need something as serious as this to get an assessment that will actually be taken seriously. For instance, one of the things we might want to refer to is there was a Royal Society meeting about sort of lessons to be learned from SARS in 2004, okay? And the editorial there, or the introduction, or whatever, is written by people including Angela McLean and Bob May, and it makes it quite plain in its that there are going to be other pandemics coming along, and next time we may not be so lucky, and we need to prepare for them. Now, did we? You know, and the answer is
government's problem.
Sorry?
It's always the next government.
Well, it's partly that, but it's also partly that SARS wasn't actually such a, you know, the deaths in SARS, thankfully, I think was a total under 1,000 or around 1,000. I mean, it was not enough, and you know, so I suppose the what I'm trying to say is a big sort of meta question is the experience of the current pandemic really going to be enough to get us a system that takes pandemics more seriously for the future?
No.
One would like to think, yeah. Oh, well, that's blunt. One would like to think that it might engender sort of a bit more in the way of international cooperation and so on. I mean, I think with things like SARS, it didn't affect the UK. I mean, you know, people kept a watchful eye in some sense, but it was something going on in another part of the world. And I think when this started, there was an element of thinking this would be the same. It was something that was going on in China, but didn't really affect Western Europe, or you know.
No, I think you're right, Valerie. That what was I going to say? But the thing, I mean, for instance, I mean, I do think if you look at the problems about acting quickly, that the answer to them probably is an effective sort of referee or independent advisor like WHO. And the thing, I mean, it does seem to me that the WHO was not forceful enough at various stages, including, you know, advice on international travel and advice on masks, which was counter-effective, to be honest. And I don't think that was, there may be an element there of just of scientific judgment that wasn't quite right, but I think there's also an element of WHO not being independent enough. So a question for the future is how can you have WHO? For instance, I think WHO, I've read several things saying that WHO was a bit soft on China just because China is such a big influence on it, and they didn't want to offend them. You know, that's the problem. And if WHO is funded by all the various countries around the world, there's always the danger.
Give independent scientific advice if it's always dependent on its donors. I suppose that's the issue.
Yeah.
And that's not going to go away.
Well, the question is, so the question is whether it could, whether there's some way of making it more independent. That's, I think,
without reinventing it.
Without reinventing, no, exactly. I mean, I think, and of course, I mean, you know, it absolutely doesn't help at the moment that it's had things like Donald Trump trying to take the US out of it, which hopefully is about to be reversed. But
I think that the question is, what's going to be different about this, you know, report? I mean, there'll be a public inquiry, like add it to the pile of public inquiries essentially that have happened, you know, BSE inquiry, whatever it is, all these lessons to be learned, which aren't essentially learned, because it makes rational sense for scientists to do this, but it doesn't make rational sense for politicians to take this on board, because, you know, it's an extreme event which is outside their political planning horizon.
Yes, well, that's a depressing take on it.
Until it is, when it's right at the top of their planning horizon. So so it's this sort of preparedness, and, you know, I mean, exercise Cygnus, as you mentioned in there. I mean, what happened there? I mean, of course, politicians get involved, right? Because this will never be like real life, so we don't really have to worry about it too much. Or it's not on my watch, which of course it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we don't want to provide a critical analysis of the pandemic, because I don't think we're the best people to do that, because we'll never have all the information, and I'm sure plenty more people will be keen to jump on that.
The big inquiry, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but we can provide, I guess, the modeler's view at least on more general challenges. I think,
and we can mention things like,
of course, yeah,
many of the things that you've been raising, but particularly things like time horizons and so on.
Yeah.
And the sort of planning. I mean, if we, going back to the structure thing, if we have a general section, I'm not sure whether it's at the beginning or the end, to cope with things like communication, for example, and particularly communication of uncertainty, that goes right through all these, probably at the beginning, I should think. Would that work, that one has a sort of, you know, general issues up front, and then these sort of this time evolution of
as though you've sort of got a column of common themes, then you've got the specific times.
I think,
and then some sort of wrap up at the end of the bits that we haven't fitted anywhere else.
But I think it needs both, Valerie, because I think it needs to.
Yes, I think it does.
I've just noticed that I haven't got the word communications in the overarching themes at the beginning, which I ought to have.
Exactly. I think that's one of the.
I think by the nature of this paper, if we call it, that those overarching themes ought to be mentioned in an introduction, but I think discussion of them should wait till the end.
Maybe.
Because I think if you go through it in stages, you know, I think you're going to want to try and pull it together at the end of all that and say which are the biggest challenges, and also, I suppose, in conclusion, one wants to maybe if I was thinking of a sort of final paragraph for this sort of, I think I'd want to make it about messages for specific communities. So to say that there's messages for scientists, the general scientists, both epidemiologists and social scientists, and the general public maybe, and politicians in all this.
So so as I say, I've come into this late. What's the sort of plan in terms of what are we kind of doing with this?
I think what we're trying to do is to try and tease out what the main challenges are. I mean, it's which, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 for each of these phases, and try and put them in a way that doesn't just throw our hands up, but offers suggestions as to what the problems are to be solved if we're to do better another time. And you know, and some of those, I think, which we probably as scientists ought to do fairly briefly, because they're perhaps a bit outside our brief, is to, you know, is to identify aspects which are really between the politicians and the voters. You know, I mean, politicians in the end will do what voters determine they should do, at least in democracies, and well, and probably in other countries too. But I think that, you know, but I think there'll be. But I mean, there'll be problems for political scientists as when there, as much as for politicians.
But I think we should concentrate. I mean, not to say we don't mention a wider range of things, but I think we should really focus on things where, as modelers, we have some expertise and can, you know, I think we should think about what are the challenges that modelers, I mean, writ large in the sort of broadest possible category, can hope to contribute to and address, so that we're in a better position next time. I think we should think about the forward-looking and particularly challenges for modelers.
Yeah. So I think it's trying to communicate from the modelling point of view how the well, how, if you like, I mean, pandemics in general are a wicked problem. I mean, in the, I mean, I know that for Bernard's piece on, there's a sort of, I don't know whether it would be a social theory sort of concept of a wicked problem being something that satisfies 10 specific criteria or whatever. So I'm speaking in a more informal way here. I think it's the combination of uncertainty and potential explosiveness that's it makes it, which, I mean, I think these are problems. I think you will find these on the list of the wicked problems, but perhaps you won't find all those 10 criteria in general, but the combination of having to take a decision quickly, you know, if you put it off, it tends to get worse. There's a lot of uncertainty. You know, how do you, at what stage do things become not sufficiently certain? Does the uncertainty sort of does it become clear that you probably need to do something rather than just sit around saying, I don't know what's going to happen? Yeah.
So in terms of, are we sort of looking at the deficiencies of information that we had as modelers? I'm thinking about, you know, social contact stuff, or are we sort of thinking about the way that modelers work with government? I'm sort of not kind of sure what the focus is, if you like.
I think the sort of social stuff would particularly, I think, come in the intervention
areas. And so things to do with lack of information that modelers need, you know, data that they need to inform their models and so on, will tend to be covered elsewhere. I mean, that's not to say we shouldn't mention it here too. And there's sort of, I think there'll be a lot of need with all these things for cross-referencing and so on. And some things may get mentioned more than once from different aspects. but I suppose here we'd be thinking particularly of things to do with policy.
I think I definitely see it, that interface between the way the modelers are working with the policymakers, and I guess it's maybe, you know, really digging into these phrases which I often see banded around in, you know, proposals and things like that, of science, this modeling work is guiding policy, or this modeling work is informing policy. And I guess really thinking about what we mean by that. Are we saying that the modelers are saying you should do X, or are the modelers more like the guiding hand of, here are the different things you could do, and here are the different things we think will happen. Now you have to make the political decision as a government. And so I think it's, you know, that's, for me, that's what I feel that this paper should really kind of dig into, that really tricky relationship, which I think is often not really explored very carefully. And I think it as modelers, there is often that danger, I think more than in any other science, because for all other scientists, if policymakers have a specific question, they typically have to look at evidence that has already been accumulated, so scientific studies that have been run, because you can't run an experimental trial or anything like that within a week, whereas you can run a model to answer a specific question within a week. And so I think it creates new problems when you're talking specifically about how modeling is being used to guide or inform or work with policymakers, which I think doesn't come up in any other science. So I think it's a very specific thing, which I think would be really interesting to explore in this paper.
That's a really nice point. I've not thought of it like that before.
That's good. You have to write that down, Chiara.
Write it down, Dora.
After all these points, a lot of good points.
I think but I think, you know, behavior will come in, behavior and communications and trust and all those things will come in maybe in the interventions, won't they? And will depend on the kind of disease you have.
But I think they're really important here too, and particularly things like, I think Duncan mentioned right at the beginning, about the fact that you know, most of the information was going through the modelling through SPI-M and not very much involvement through SPI-B, and maybe that behavioural stuff should have been integrated much better earlier on, and so on. And those are things which perhaps come here more than anywhere else.
I suppose, you know, one way of sort of approaching it is to look at, you know, what the structure was of the scientific advice, certainly the SAVE side of it, in terms of how that evolved over time as well. So, you know, looking at the minutes and the subcommittees and thinking about who was on that over time, and was that the best thing to have done?
I must say, I mean, my overarching impression is it was an overcomplicated hierarchical sort of scheme, where I think you know, I think it could be very easy to not to get the best, quickest advice. I think.
And it's interesting, you know, going from this problem to, as you say, a bureaucracy essentially being set up with, you know, Government Office for Science, in terms of, you know, as you say, it's set up as a hierarchy, and those two, SPI-M and SPI-B, don't meet. But, you know, maybe as time went on, there was more interface there. In terms of, and the other thing I think is important about the different stages. So, you know, the whole Imperial College model, shall we say, was fine, but then there was almost a breakdown of trust in terms of actually going from advice to suddenly, you know, you're being attacked as a modeler, and therefore the sort of advice in terms of is written in a more defensive way, because you realize that actually, you know, these decisions may be out in the public eye, as opposed to working with policymakers. You know, I think there's the shift towards defensive writing in terms of that relationship between policymakers and the modelers, or the scientific advice, I think has changed, evolved over the time.
Yeah.
And it might also be worth looking into the I don't know whether, Lisa, you've heard of these health protection research units. They were set up in 2015. And I think that's specifically why LSHTM and Imperial really dominated from the beginning, because they were they had it in their grant that they had to have a responsive element. So when something comes up, they were the people who were called upon. So at least that was my understanding. Like that was, I was just there when they were set up back, actually it was 2013, I think they began. So, and LSHTM and Imperial have typically dominated in that area, and that has played out within Public Health England. The modelling unit is very much split between LSHTM and Imperial. Right. Okay. So pretty much all of the old head of the modelling unit at Public Health England, John Edmonds, had a honorary appointment at LSHTM. And then when he left, they got somebody in called Peter White, who had an honorary appointment at Imperial. And there was, when I was there, there was a tension between, there was a group, half of the people had honorary appointments at LSHTM and half had honorary appointments at Imperial. So those two were the two that had direct links into PHE.
It's almost the politics of the scientists rather than. But
I think there is that element to sort of. I'm not saying we delve into it in this paper, but to be aware of, as you know, why certain people were called upon, and it wasn't just a call that went out to the general group, like general, you know, scientists of like, we need people.
And then, of course, you know, the whole thing about RAMP, the Royal Society thing, was, you know, at least when I saw it coming around, it was almost as though, right, let's stop everyone making their new models. And I, you know, when I first saw it, I thought it was a sort of more, I interpreted as a more sort of agent-based approach, which perhaps wasn't being done in either of those. And so rather, you know, it was almost set up as a parallel way of modeling it, which wasn't Imperial and wasn't the London School. And it was almost a new attempt, and you know, you could say how well that went as well. But
I think there was miscommunication from the beginning, in that I think it seemed from the outside that it was LSHTM and Imperial, but from speaking to people like Julia Gogg, I get the impression that that wasn't actually the case of what was going on, and there was much more involvement from other groups. They just weren't as maybe vocal in speaking to.
I wonder if that was right at the beginning. So as you say, you know, you've got those two main groups, and then, you know, Warwick, etc., come on later.
I think they were there from the beginning.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure because Matt Keeling as well, I guess I think they called into action probably LSHTM and Imperial because of the HPRUs, but then also they have the wider group that have worked on things like BSE and foot and mouth. And that would have brought in people like Warwick. So I think they were there right from the beginning. From people speaking to people like Louise Dyson, she was working on this from the end of February.
But of course, I mean, that may be true, and you probably look at the SPI-M minutes to see who was there. But I suppose the other point is who's actually representing that on SAGE. So, you know, and then of course you've got we look at, you know, perhaps that side of things, but the other interface is between SAGE and, you know, the Cabinet Office, COBRA, right? And we're all looking at the SAGE minutes, but of course the minutes of what actually gets decided in policy, I haven't seen those yet. And so, you know, we're almost concentrating on the technical side as opposed to how that gets through a hierarchy and to actually in front of policymakers. So there's that step within the scientific advice, and there's that interface between scientific advice and policy.
I mean, going back to what Kira was just saying, I mean, you've got those two groups, Imperial and School of Hygiene, that have both, because presumably of the roles they've had, but they're very, very big. And of course, they've got a lot bigger over the last few months, but those groups are huge. The one at Warwick was much smaller and still is, I think, although it's expanded a lot. But they basically, most of the modelers in the country had links to those groups. I mean, even the Oxford people mostly had links to Imperial as well. So the number of people outside that is really proportionately very, very small. You know, there's a couple of people up in Manchester and so on, and small numbers down in Exeter and so on. But I mean, these are small numbers compared with this great mass in those two places. So I think it's inevitable that they seem to sort of dominate. And of course, they're the people that get all the publicity, because even if it was sort of quite even-handed on an individual basis, just the sheer scale of those two groups means that inevitably they're the ones that you keep hearing about.
But maybe it's Chiara's point about responsiveness, in that they have a model ready to go.
Yeah, exactly.
And any models, well, I don't know, a model that works is much better than having no model right at the beginning. And I suppose,
but also in their grant specifically says that 20% of their time has to be for emergency response, or something like that. Maybe it's 5%, 10%. So I guess there is also that element of, when Public Health England are being pressured by government to start looking at this stuff, they will automatically call on them, and they can't say no because it's in their grant. So they're being paid to do this. So I think there is that kind of that link in there, as which may not be necessarily have been a bad thing. I guess with this paper, it might also be worth looking at what things were set up that helped and maybe should be done more or in a better way as well.
But that, I mean, to talk, you were talking about the link with Public Health England, because when I was sort of looking at this in spring or February, really, it couldn't really see that link between Public Health England. Maybe it was implicit in the modelling, in that they were, but it was almost as though it was kind of completely isolated from public health. But maybe that's wrong. I don't know.
So I think often things are maybe not as publicised with Public Health England as they. So I mean, they can't publish very quickly because all their publications have to be signed off. And I should think they wouldn't sign off anything on COVID-19 at the moment because of like they have to be checking everything. But I definitely think it was there in that places like LSHTM and Imperial, all these HPRUs, they had to have a named PI or a named grant holder person who was part of Public Health England.
All right. Okay.
So, I mean, I should think there were probably elements that were doing things separate, because Public Health England is a massive thing in itself with its own politics going on. But I would have been surprised if there hadn't have been that link in. And
it wasn't really explicit, I suppose, but it may have been there.
No, I agree, it wasn't. I think that whole transparency of how these things are put together and how it all works is another thing which makes it difficult, and I think leads to maybe mistrust as well, not necessarily with the public, but just also in general with the wider scientific community. Why were Imperial chosen over, why was their model the first one to be published? Why did everyone think that was the one that was, the main one? So yeah, I think transparency and how these organizations are set up could be an important.
Do we want to remain UK focused?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, before this, we would think there would be a lot of much more cooperation in terms of, but even with every country, if you look at the CDC list of models as well, it's huge. And every country basically did their own thing. And maybe these groups are working with other. I didn't really see that the modelling. Of course, they're getting data and from other countries, but it wasn't. I didn't really see cooperative modelling going on between countries. I mean, there may be, but
yeah, my impression was much the same. I think there were a lot of contacts. I mean, these people are in a big international network, but that was very much in terms of exchanging data, and that's my impression anyway, and information about the latest knowledge of the virus rather than about details of the modelling.
Which is interesting because every country is trying to solve the same problem and every country is producing 10 models.
I'm afraid I have to go to another meeting, but thank you very much for very interesting discussions. And Lisa, just give me a shout if you need any help with putting together draft stuff. Thanks, guys.
See you later. Bye.
Thanks, Chiara.
I've got to leave at 11:15, but
yeah, okay. So probably we ought to sort of firm up where we go next.
Yeah, so should I add in the points that we discussed today, and I guess have a think about the structure? Although we're quite happy with this setup, aren't we? The headings for the
I think
moment.
we're broadly happy.
I think we'd do better to sort of populate this, and we can
Yes, concentrate on.
reshuffle of structure if it then looks. I mean, I think what we've been discussing is a sort of politicization of scientists there, really, weren't we? I mean, that's, and I think there has been a problem. I mean, I think that, I think I can remember with the AIDS epidemic, I think that was the early days of Imperial rather trying to monopolize government advice.
Yeah, to some extent, I suppose, but I mean, there was a Department of Health working group was set up, and there were about half a dozen or so different modelling groups around the country who each produced models and predictions and so on, and we put them all together in a report. I mean, they were all based on very, very little information, especially compared with, I mean, I know we think we don't have much information about coronavirus. We've got a huge amount more than we had about HIV. So I think there was, I mean, Roy Anderson was an important player then with good links to government or to the civil service, so Department of Health and so on. So inevitably one heard about that, but I think there were quite a few groups, but they were small. I mean, they were individuals. They weren't, or half a dozen people. They weren't these massive teams that we have now. And of course, there was much less computing power possible. So what you could actually do, it was much more back of the envelope and simple sets of differential equations, and there was some people were doing deterministic and some stochastic, but broadly they were all using the same model structure and allowing for the uncertainties. So I don't think there was the same dominance, except that there were a few people who were very good spokesmen, and so you tended to hear about where they'd come from more than anything else. Anyway, sorry, that's a diversion. I
mean, I think that for me it would I think it would be immensely helpful to develop a sort of reading list, a sort of link to the structure, so sort of to just linking in, because I think there's people have written thoughtful pieces on most of these issues, and to maybe pool our knowledge of the sort of best statements we find of the problems in these specific areas, and I suppose if the ideal contribution there says, look at the well, for instance, I mean, look at, for an example would be that SARS review volume and the advice that came out. There's the one-page sort of introduction to that volume, which I've referred to. But if I was putting that in the Dropbox, as it were, I would think it helpful to write a sort of 2-sentence summary of it, something. So, see what I mean? So, as if, or at least say which sort of points it's relating to.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried though that we're going to end up with something which is it's not sort of, it's not written from our own expertise, but that is sort of more to do with challenges that I mean, I think are really valid, but where we're not the obvious people to write that challenge particularly, you know, that I think we need somehow to make sure that, I mean, I think these things are worth mentioning, but we should put most of our effort into thinking, you know, if we're thinking about planning for future pandemics, many of those challenges are ones for policymakers, but they're not, it seems to me, specifically things where modelers can make a real contribution. Whereas other things, in terms of having preparedness of modeling groups who are in a position to be able to step in and step up at short notice and all the other things, that is something where we would say more about. So
maybe it's sort of saying what ideally we would like as modelers, because, you know, we can produce models. I mean, you know, that's in a sense trivial. I mean, of course, you know, but it's actually getting those models used by policymakers, which is tricky. And so, you know, we can sort of say, well, but it is that interface really, which I think is,
and perhaps something about the structure that's needed to make that work well.
I think that's right, because, you know, we can say what would we want in terms of structure, and how much would we want to be, and where would we want to be with working with or for policymakers.
And I mean, so in terms of the current pandemic, one can use it as examples of specific points that we want to make without sort of trying to say what's gone wrong particularly.
Because at the moment we're sort of in a structure. We've got a structure of the modelling, which is set up in terms of, you know, say SPI-M, SAGE, COBRA. Is that the best structure? I mean, I don't know. It's probably the best structure for policymakers, because they can always say, well, you know, the scientific advice, etc. But, you know, do we want to actually be working in government? And then, of course, you get to other problems about if you're using, you know, at least people on SPI-M can publish their stuff. Whereas, of course, once you get into, you know, and then there's the sort of thing about, you know, how what about secret this stuff is, because of course it shouldn't be secret at all, which is kind of different from other sort of problems, you know. So so Dennis, you were saying if it's a wicked problem, how do you kind of unwicked it?
I think that's a very good, you know, and I think transparency is which I think is what you're referring to there, is something to refer to, isn't it? That you know, some you can see when governments are taking decisions that they have to have some confidential things, but equally, if you really want to get the widest possible advice, it's immensely helpful to be transparent. And
I think what's also interesting is if you look at the sort of government's response to this, quite a lot of the sort of operational stuff has been done through, you know, management consultants and outsourcing to the private sector. And it's quite interesting that the modelling hasn't been. Of course, that could just be all the expertise is within universities, but it's quite interesting that the consultants haven't come up with, this is the model for a pandemic. .pptx.
They have been a bit,
right,
through RAMP. Some of the groups that we've seen involved, I mean, not to any major extent, I suppose, but some of the groups that we've seen involved have come from the private sector, have come from, I don't know, you know, big architectural companies and design of buildings, supermarkets, you know, transport, quite a lot of areas where they have models for buildings and moving people around, building sort of small spaces.
But there hasn't been a sort of government push.
No, no. I mean that's come from,
which I think is something that's, to be frank, gone wrong at various levels, but not in the modelling. I mean, I think.
No, you're right. That the sort of thing I was thinking was very much groups that have responded to the RAMP call that came not just from the universities.
But they do have the practical expertise, and they are doing this.
They are doing
all the time.
yes.
Yeah.
And RAMP has certainly been trying to harness that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Well.
Yes. So I feel the big question is, because I think what we're trying to do with all these things is to have regular meetings so that we know what's what, and just sort of set a time in the diary so that everybody can plan round. So a priority would be, do we want another meeting, and if so, when? And obviously, ideally, to try and get more people involved. And I don't know when is a good time. I mean, I don't know whether we deduce that now is not a good time because, the people who weren't able to be here, or who aren't here anyway. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about this, anybody?
Well, maybe just send round a, doodle poll thing and get people to.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I mean, I was just having a quick look, and on the Slack channel for this group, there are 12 people listed. There may be a bit of duplication. I mean, I'm there twice, but other than that, so that's probably 11.
I think a doodle poll is quite a good idea. I think it'd be nice to have another meeting next week. I'm away Monday, so preferably not Monday. But
an experiment then of not Mondays.
Yeah. But for me at the moment, well, we've probably got a regular modelling slot on Friday mornings, haven't we, Valerie?
Yeah.
But otherwise, for the coffee/tea slots, the other 7 Tuesday to Friday, I don't think are spoken for. So.
Well, I don't think it matters if we pick the same slot as another group, unless there are people that want to be in both, because I mean, I think there are channels and breakout rooms and so on and so forth available.
But I'll happily do a doodle poll for everyone on the Slack list.
Could you do that? That would be great.
And I'll try and say to people if they could get back to us within 24 hours if possible. So because it's we try and avoid clashes if we can. So quicker the better.
And I think Lisa gets a double vote since we need her to be.
Yeah.
This is the real.
Well, the thing about the doodle poll is you do see who's. It's not just a question of numbers. You do see who can make which. And Hannah seemed to be particularly wanting to contribute, so I think we should try and make sure Hannah's there next time.
Yes, that would be good. And that probably means it.
Meanwhile, I think if people would,
in the morning,
if people would like to go through the draft and make suggestions as to sharpening things up, adding linking in references of things we might read, and by all means putting in sort of comments perhaps in italics or brackets of something of this is a question for the policy makers, the question for modelers is more something else. Do comment on the appropriateness. I mean, my feeling remains to be holistic, that one should mention all the problems, but if 50% of them are for policymakers, we can mention them all quite briefly.
Sure.
And concentrate on the ones where we've got expertise. Absolutely.
Could I suggest that people track changes, because some of the documents that we're circulating around are just changed without any tracking, and then you look at it and you think, I wonder what changed from the last time I read it.
Excuse me, I've got to go.
I think track change is a good idea for the first off, and we can then revise the whole thing
Yes,
Or-
and then lose the tracking and accept things, but just so that we don't
Start
have
off on the next version, yes, because you don't want to be.
yeah, I think that would be good. Okay,
Right.
so
Okay, so should I? I'll add in everything we discussed today,
that
and then
would be
people can
super if you could
comment.
do that
Yeah, we'll do that.
relatively quickly, Lisa, before and then
Yeah.
the rest of us can have a look after that, and that would make it
Yeah. So I'll try to
easier
do
for us
that
anyway.
today. Yeah.
Okay, that's
Okay.
great. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to stop the recording if I can remember how to do it. Oh no, that's end meetings for all. I'm still struggling to find the right button, but not to what stop recording. There we go.
Okay.